Welcome to our podcast. We're excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I am the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I'll be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. We are so glad to have you listening again this week. In the studio I have joining with me is Rebekah Gilmore. She is pursuing her master's in counseling at Liberty University. And I'm excited to have Rebekah join us as we continue our conversation on boundaries. We've had quite a bit of conversation over the last few weeks. If people haven't heard our podcast, hopefully they can go on and listen to the other ones. But it's been good to have Rebekah in the studio with that. If you haven't heard those shows, make sure you look at our show notes, go back and catch those other shows. But for now, I encourage you to go grab something to take some notes because we're going to dig into today's topic. Welcome to the show, Rebekah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm so glad that we continue to have this conversation on boundaries. It is definitely a well-needed topic in our culture today.
Definitely.
Yeah. I can't think of how many times I've talked to somebody and they've either said, I wish I would have known about boundaries when I was younger.
Yeah, I know I have. I wish I had heard more about it as well.
Yeah.
Just the terminology itself.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think we've talked about this in the podcast, how boundaries is a relatively newer term that we're using in culture. And I think just like anything that's a newer topic, sometimes we define it incorrectly. And I said, that's probably another thing that I see a lot with people when I talk to them about boundaries. They're like, oh yeah, I know what a boundary is, but they flip the definition to what's not actually accurate.
Yeah, or they're just assuming or guessing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and because it depends on their experiences with boundaries, and so that's why I'm so excited that we're doing these podcasts because it is such a vital topic, whether you've been through trauma, abuse, or any negative experience, really, you need to know how to deal with boundaries.
Yeah.
And even if you've been brought up in maybe you've always had healthy role models around you, I might suggest that you still might not 100% know how to manage healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
Because we all have some kind of proclivity towards, not setting healthy limits. Mm-hmm. And so learning how to do that well is so important in our relationships with everyone.
Yeah, you might think it's a healthy relationship and think the boundaries, the examples that people might be setting of boundaries, that just might be the only thing you know. Mm-hmm. And
right,
and that's just what you're expecting. You might think it's a healthy boundary, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, exactly. Because we do by what we know.
Yeah.
If you think about if you were to visit another country, the reason why people in that country do the behaviors or have the behaviors that they have is because that's the environment they've always been brought up in.
Yeah.
And so if we were to visit the other country, we'd bring our American behaviors over to that country, or vice versa. If somebody comes from another country from over in Europe, they would bring their behaviors that they've always been raised around to America. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes that can cause conflict or confusion because we're like, well, why do you do it this way? Well, it's what we know.
Yeah.
So I always like to think about we do better when we know better. And I think about that with boundaries. Until we know better, we can't do better.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So the last few weeks, we really, like I said, we've been talking about boundaries. And the last time we talked more on boundaries in relationship to friends and family. Mm-hmm. Could you do a little bit of recap for our listeners so they might, if they haven't heard, they can go back and go like, oh, I need to hear that. Or if they have heard, to kind of refresh their memory about what we discussed.
Yeah. So with boundaries and your friends, I believe is where we left off. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the different relationship types. Mm-hmm. And we went over being a compliant and then having a friend that's also a compliant. Mm-hmm. Another scenario was if you're a compliant and then your friend is the aggressive controller, or maybe you're the aggressive controller. Yeah. And then another one was compliant and the other half manipulative controller. And then the last one that we discussed was the compliant non-responsive scenarios.
So probably the consistent word that everybody's hearing through that, if they didn't listen to our podcast, is the word compliant.
Yes, there's always one person as the compliant usually.
Yeah. And so if that's your story, you might be like, I need to really go listen to this. But I think regardless of which side of the boundary line that you're on, you really need to understand boundaries better so you can be in those better relationships. Can you explain why there's always a compliant person?
I would think that growing up, for a compliant, you learn a behavior or you become afraid at a young age for just disappointing somebody else. You can just be afraid to say no. You might have had a bad experience when you were young and somebody reacted poorly to your no, which creates that behavior, learning to be compliant.
Yeah. So it goes back to what we talked about, I think, in one of the last couple of podcasts, is that attachment that we have with those when we're from our family of origin, right? And that's just what you're saying is when we're brought up, we learn how to attach, we learn how to relate.
Yeah.
And because of that, it directs how we interact as adults.
Yeah, and it's always just to look for that acceptance and love, right? And you find a way to do that at a young age. It just might not be the most healthy way for you as you get older.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So that is why we want to learn how to do that, because it goes back to your default behaviors. We all have them. And so until we learn how to have those new behaviors, those new ways of responding, those new ways of understanding our own triggers, our own response mechanisms, we're going to always default back to certain ways of reacting, responding, feeling.
Yeah.
And that's why it's really important for us to learn and grow together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today, though, we're going to take a little bit of a shift from family and friends to something a little bit more specific. Do you want to tell everybody the topic for today?
Yeah, so we're going to actually talk about boundaries and your spouse. So this is going to be an interesting one.
Yeah. So it will be, because sometimes when the closer relationship, it can maybe touch on a few more nerves.
Yeah.
Because, we're really close with that person, and it can be challenging to set up good and healthy boundaries, especially as we've talked about, if you don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And what if your spouse is coming from a place to where they don't know how to set up good boundaries? So two people who maybe have not had good role models, or even if they have had good role models, didn't implement what they learned.
Yeah.
Then now as adults, you have two people trying to wrestle through that. And sometimes just in the early part of our relationships, that's what we do. We wrestle through, how do we do all the things together? How do we be in relationship together? And so there's a lot of learning.
Yeah, I can see it being hard because two people bring in their own idea of what setting a boundary is, right? And so it can be confusing.
Yeah, because I keep thinking of the word that keeps popping in my head as we're talking is when we think about boundaries is when you have two people that come together. Some people might have translated that word boundary to being a wall.
Yeah.
And so being really rigid is what I mean by that. So in other words, like if I say this is the only option.
Yeah.
And that causes a level of conflict in that relationship. Or they might be maybe the opposite and be like, I'm not going to have they don't have a wall, but maybe they have what I'd kind of describe as a dotted line, right? So like they have like a short little boundary and then there's a break, and the short little boundary and then there's a break. And so it's almost like this ebb and flow. And so I'm just kind of thinking in my head as I'm talking about this, because if you had somebody who had the wall and somebody who had a dotted line kind of boundary system,
what a mess.
Yeah, right? Because now I'm just seeing conflict, right?
Yeah.
Like, so because the one person like, they're very rigid, this is the only way. And the other person's like, I'm going to be, we'll call it flexible. And it feels sometimes when you're in that flexible state that you're being...
like you're sacrificing for the other person.
Yeah, you're being adaptable. You're trying to be compassionate.
Which can be hard if the other person's only got their wall. And they're not doing the same thing. And so you can see how that could make the person with the dotted line to feel a little like maybe they're in the relationship more than the other person.
Yeah. Because then on the other side too, I think about the person who has the wall that they use as their boundary, that they do that sometimes for security.
Yeah.
It's a safety side for them. So I need this wall because this is the only way I feel safe.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm rigid, because when I go outside of the confines of whatever that boundary for them is, that wall, there's fear. It's kind of underlying. They might not recognize it initially, but there's a lot of fear in that space.
Yeah, for the person with the wall, they might that's just what they've learned to do to keep themselves safe.
Yeah. So when we think about boundaries within a marital relationship, which is what we're talking about today, when we become married, that relationship is the two people coming together to make really one, is what we talk about, especially from that scriptural standpoint. So it means it's the melding together.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you don't have a separateness.
Exactly. And that's what boundaries are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it can be confusing to think about, because you think, when you get married, you're becoming one. And so you kind of have to always just somehow mesh together. Yeah. But you can't lose your separateness in that at the same time. Yeah, because you're still an individual.
Yeah. Because I think about sometimes when we have that togetherness and we want to have that togetherness, we become more, I think back on the compliant, or I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to go along for the ride, so to speak, to do what they need us to do. And that can be the male or female side, right? It's not one or it could be either one that falls into that role. And so that by doing that, it can feel as if you don't have permission, almost, where you can have separateness. And that separateness is really where we learn how to be who we're designed to be. Yeah. It doesn't mean we're living in isolation, we're not in relationship. But what it means is we are together, but I'm also a separate person too.
Yeah, and you're going to have your own separate desires, feelings, your own separate wants. And that's okay. You don't have to morph to the other person's desires, feelings, and wants. Yeah. And I think some people might feel like they need to do that, and that might be their idea of intimacy, reaching that level of intimacy. But I argue that in the sense that if you are able to stay separate with those feelings and desires, that's where you find true intimacy.
Yeah. Can you think of an example how that's maybe played out in a relationship where somebody might have been like, okay, I've gotten married and now I just really want to make sure my partner, my spouse, knows that I'm all in. And so they just keep adapting and keep their boundary line keeps shifting of what they're willing to do, whereas before they were married, they might have not done that. And so I don't know if you have an example that might pop into your head, because I love thinking about examples, because I think it's really good for our listeners as we're talking to be able to go, I can relate to that.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many. I think a simple one that comes to mind is, let's say one party in the relationship is really, really passionate about a sport that they play, and they're always putting all of their time into that, and then the other person pretty much starts giving up all of their desires and just time that they have, I guess, to spend towards their own things that they enjoy, and they end up giving all that time to the other person and maybe pick up the sport that they really don't like, but they just want to do it for the other person to find some level of similar enjoyment.
Yeah. And on the surface, it might be like, well, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
I just want to be with them. And so we're not saying that you can't go and be like, enjoy do a sport that you maybe aren't fond of, to go spend time with your spouse. But the differentiation is what you said, is that because they were willing to not have any limitations, like, I want to go be with you, but let's find something we could do together, or let's find something we both enjoy. Or maybe this time I'll go do something you want to do, and next time we'll do something I want to do. So it's how can we still have the togetherness but separateness? Because we don't have to become one identity.
Yeah, and you don't have to give up all of the things that you love and enjoy.
Yeah, that's so true. So I think that's really good as we continue the conversation today of thinking about that boundary in relationships and marriages, hopefully our listeners can kind of hold on to that image of what does it look like to have separateness but togetherness, because it is very confusing to say you want to be separate but together, because those words feel conflicting. They feel separate.
Yeah. I mean, haven't you heard the phrase from people before? I know I have. Somebody feeling like they've lost themselves, you know?
Yeah. And that can be really common in marriages.
Yeah.
Sometimes young marriages, but also marriages where people have been in that relationship for decades are like, I don't even know who I am anymore.
That's what I think about.
Yeah, like, and then that can be a challenge, especially if you've been married to that person for a long time and that spouse passes away and you've lost who you are. You've never had that separateness. Yeah. That grieving can be even more challenging.
Yeah, to work through what you're actually feeling when you've directed it towards the other person for so long.
Yeah, and then your identity was wrapped up in the other person, and now they're not here. So where's my identity at?
Yeah, that would be tough.
Yeah. So these are all kind of reasons what we're talking about. Knowing what our boundaries are will be helpful. And it doesn't matter what age you're at, too. Boundaries are something that you can establish and learn how to do. Now, if you are in your 80s and 90s and you're like, hey, this is the first time I'm learning this, we're not saying it's going to be a piece of cake. Even if you're younger, in your 50s, 60s, whatever age. It doesn't really matter what age you're at is what I'm trying to say. Boundaries are going to be a challenge to learn. The longer you've been practicing whatever you've been practicing, of your behaviors, your patterns of boundaries, it's going to take a little bit longer to learn new ways of responding.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's impossible. So as we think about boundaries in that relationship standpoint, one of the first things that kind of comes to mind is our feelings. We've kind of touched on them a little bit. So let's expand that conversation and we think about feelings in the marital relationship and boundaries.
Yeah. So I would say we must take responsibility for our feelings, and rather than focusing on what the other person is doing and how we think that they should change, but we should be more so thinking and self-reflecting about what we're feeling and to take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
And then we also have to communicate that to the other person, which is the tough part.
Yeah, because sometimes we don't want it. We think we can't share our feelings.
Yeah.
Like, what if I do that? What if I tell them what I'm really thinking or that I'm angry at them? What if I tell them that I'm disappointed in them?
What are they going to do?
Yeah, what are they going to do? Will they leave me?
Yeah.
And so a lot of times our own fears and insecurities come up especially tied into feelings.
Yeah.
And so I love how you talked about that we have to talk about them. We have to tell them if we're in a married relationship with another partner, we have to be able to communicate with them, because if not, what happens to those feelings? Where do they go?
They just stay inside. They
And
build.
Yeah, right. They don't just disappear.
No.
Right. That would be nice to think, well, if I just don't talk about them, they're going to go away. Well, you might stop thinking about them for a minute, but they're still there.
Yeah, and then they'll come when an event happens again. Those feelings will just be right back and stronger.
Yep, and that's what we call a trigger, right?
Yeah.
So now you have something that you've built in that now is a triggering event.
Yeah.
Because you haven't dealt with it. That's why you have to communicate, because if not, that trigger takes hold.
Yeah.
So it's really important for us to talk through what we're feeling, and then be able to take responsibility of our feelings too. So just because, let's just say your partner, your spouse comes in and they come in and they say something to you, and what they say is maybe pretty benign, so it's not directly mean or hurtful, but their very benign statement made you feel badly. It made you feel unheard or hurt or not cared about. And so now, instead of owning your feelings, you project them back on the other person.
Yeah. And you
not that you would do that or I would do that.
Of course
No,
not.
we don't do those things. But yeah.
Yeah, and then you pretty much will maybe lash back at them or say something passive aggressive or rude because you've had your feelings hurt,
Yep.
which then just escalates the issue or continues it. And the other side, the other person will kind of be in the dark, not knowing what they said.
Yeah. So if anybody's listening, like, oh, I've kind of been in that scenario where somebody said something, I felt really mad at them. I was really upset. And sometimes what we can do, especially as I think women and some men, but I think women are probably more known for this, is that when we get angry, we give the cold shoulder, as it's kind of called, or silent treatment, and we just get really, we kind of stonewall them. Yeah. And then the man sitting over there going, what's wrong? Like, what's going on?
Why is she acting
like
so mean?
And then what a lot of times women say, you should know. I'm not going to tell you. You should just know. like
you should know what you said.
You should know, and you should know what it meant to me.
Yeah, and even like if it's somebody that's been married for years too. Yeah, I know I've heard. Well, you should know by now.
Like, right. Like, we've been over this before.
Yeah.
This is not the first time. You should know what I think by now.
Yeah, but that also goes back to the separateness I think about.
Oh, yeah.
And they're thinking something totally different and separate from you.
Right. And that's good that there's a separateness, but that's where we have to be able to communicate, because if not, what we're literally expecting them to do is to read our mind.
I know, yeah.
And I have not learned that skill yet.
No, I try to assume that my other person does not know what I'm thinking.
Right. I mean, it's right. That's healthy to think that way, because most of the time what I think may be totally off from the other person. Yeah. And that can be, and while we're talking the confines of marriage today, that can be in any relationship, right? Yeah. I mean, that where I even think like a boss employee, they come in and the boss is having a moment and they say something, and maybe their moment that they're having is in relation to something totally different from you. But because you're in kind of the crossfires, if you will, you're like, I'm going to get fired.
Yeah, you take it personally.
I'm like, they don't like me. Yeah. And it's
wasn't directed towards you.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
And so it's really important for that communication piece. Like, so we go back to that relationship we were talking about with the husband and wife, and one of them says something really benign, and then the person feels hurt. Mm-hmm. How would they need to walk through that? Can we kind of?
Yeah. In that scenario, I would think the wife would have to first recognize that maybe I don't have all the facts. Maybe I need to.
I love that.
Find out what he's thinking. You can start out by asking questions. Hey, what did you mean when you said that? Mm-hmm. And then you can say, hey, when you said this, it hurt my feelings. Yeah. I felt like you meant this. Is that what you meant?
Yes. I love that you also added, here's what I felt, but is that what you meant? Right? Yeah. Because sometimes we'll stop at, you hurt my feelings. This is what happened. Fix it, please. Right? And we don't say the fix it, please, but we're thinking it. Right?
Yeah.
Like, here's what you said.
You should also know to fix it.
You should know to fix it, because I'm not going to tell you every thought I have. I'm just going to tell you a couple of them. You got to fill in the blanks. And that's not fair. It's not how you build a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
And so by being able to go back to them and saying, here's how it made me feel. Is this true?
Yeah.
And then pause. Give the other person space to actually tell them, give you feedback.
Yeah.
And be willing to hear them.
Yeah.
Those can be really challenging, because maybe you're not in a space where you can hear them yet.
Yeah, you might be expecting and hoping for them to say something specific.
Yes. Don't write the story before it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can't write the narrative, as well. I say, like, sometimes we're like you're saying, like, we ask them a question, we're like, I need them to say these things for it to all be okay. And they say something like, that's not what I said. And you're like,
that's not what I meant. Whoa.
Yeah. Well, I need more. I need you to say, you are a wonderful human being. I love you. And you are special beyond measure. And I would never think that of you. I treasure you deeply. And they just said, that's not what I meant. I don't know how you got that. And you're like, they don't like me. And so give them space, right? We need to give each other space to kind of really talk that out.
Yeah.
So we can have that healthy dynamic, because if we can't hear each other, then we can't hear the truth. Yeah. And if we can't hear the truth, we can't build a solid relationship together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then that kind of takes us to then the topic of desire. So we talked a lot about our feelings and how those come out in our emotions. But what about our desires? How do desires and boundaries go together in that relationship?
Yeah. So when there's a conflict in the relationship, you have to somehow be able to clarify where your boundaries are within that, or not your boundaries, your desires. Sorry.
Yeah.
Where your desires are in the conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to know what our and we kind of touched on it a little bit, right? We have to know what we want and know what we need. But again, if we don't communicate that clearly, if we just expect whoever to read our mind, our partner to read it and go, we told them like how I feel, but now you should know what I desire to get right now.
Yeah, you're going to set yourself up for disappointment that way. Another thing, I think, if you're the one that is looking for that, if you're the one needing something more, and if you're needing that clarification, you kind of are the one responsible to get that.
Yeah.
And so that goes back to taking responsibility for those feelings and taking responsibility for the desires you have.
Yeah. Yeah, it does it. You have the responsibility as the person who has the feelings to go to the other person and say, I feel this. And because I feel this, I need clarification. Yeah. And then if like maybe you're like thinking, you're like, man, I just really want them to give me a hug. It might feel silly, but you might need to say, hey, after you work through some things, I just need a hug from you right now.
Yeah.
I need you to sit with me and hold my hand. If you don't communicate to them that, and you're thinking in your head, they never give me a hug when I need it.
Yeah.
Again, you need to tell them. And it sounds really simple. And it might sound like, I think sometimes we can go back and kind of do that little side. They should know. Why do I have to tell them? That's ridiculous.
They should know when I need a hug.
Yeah, they should just know. Like it's on my face.
Yeah, but not everybody needs a hug
at
the same times or over the same things. So,
because I think that's going back to one, expressing what your desires, because your desires are going to be different than their desires because of that separateness.
Yeah.
And so because you're going to make the assumption that that is what they would need too.
Exactly.
But they might need something totally different in that scenario.
And usually that is the case.
Almost always, right?
Yes.
Especially in a marital relationship, there's that I have a different need than the other.
Yeah. The other thing too I wanted to touch on is if you don't get that response back that you're looking for, that you have to be responsible to grieve over the disappointment that you're not getting what you're wanting.
Yep.
And then not punish them for it. So we did talk a little bit about that, where we give them the cold shoulder.
Yep.
And don't talk to them. And give them way too much space that they didn't ask for.
Yeah, right? So we can't use our feelings as weapons. We have to be able to communicate clearly, tell them what's going on, and then accept. I think that's really key, is we have to accept what they can give back to us, especially if we don't tell them what we need. Because sometimes even if we say to them, like, this is what I need, and they're like, maybe they're like, I can't do that for you right now.
Yeah, or they don't give it to you in the way you're wanting.
Yeah. And that could feel hurtful. And so there is a level of grieving going, that's not what I wanted. I mean, I really wanted them to do it this way, but they only gave it to me. They said no, or they said not now, or they did what I asked, but it wasn't right.
Yeah.
I do that in quotation, right, because we have in our mind what's right. And so giving each other that freedom to be that separate individual that's trying to love each other well and recognize that we both have different needs, desires, feelings.
Yeah.
So there is a limit on what we can, kind of what we've been talking about, what we can do. And that's really important for us to recognize in this process, because we can't be all things to all people, even to our spouse.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
I think that it looks like giving out of your pure heart to give, not giving to get something from the other person, and just realizing what you truly have available within yourself to give out of a loving heart.
Yeah. Because we can't always we might have a desire to do more than what we have capacity to give.
Yeah.
But being able to recognize, like, hey, sometimes there's just a limit.
Yeah. And to become aware of that limit. And if you start to give past the point, I guess you could call it the love point, past the love point, and if you move into the resentment point.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good, because we want to make sure we're doing it out of the right motivation, the right intent. And there's going to be different seasons where sometimes our limits are going to shift on both sides for ourselves and our spouse, and recognizing that sometimes we can give more and sometimes we need to receive more.
Yeah.
And to be able to be willing to do that on both sides of the fence, it will be important to kind of navigate through that together, because we don't want to get into a point. I'm thinking of like a spouse who might have recently gone back to work, and now suddenly a disproportionate amount of the household chores goes to the other spouse, and they're just like, and they may initially want to, but instead of communicating their limits of what they can do, they just keep taking on more and more and more stuff, and then now they're starting to feel resentful because they haven't said, like, I'm cool with doing dishes twice a week or 3 times a week, but other than that, we got to figure out a system. Yeah. Right. But instead, they just hold it inside and they just keep doing it every day. And then they get to Sunday or Saturday and they have like a whole day together, and all of a sudden they erupt. And they're like, and the other person's like, well, where did this come from? Yeah.
And they're blaming the other person for not setting those limits when it was their own limits to define.
Right.
And
because again, it kind of goes back to, there was a shift in the dynamic of that relationship, right, of what they were able to do, but there was the expectation the other person should just know. I'm at my limit. They should just know. Yeah. And so I've even had to practice that in my own relationship, where I've had to be more intentional of just saying to my husband, listen, I'm at my limit, or I'm overwhelmed right now, or I really need your help with this. As if I don't tell him, I'm internally getting really frustrated and having this expectation that he should just know, or he should be able to read my body cues. Yeah. And that's a lot to expect of somebody when I don't even read my own cues very well often.
Or somebody else's cues even too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that this is a really good conversation for us to continue to kind of think through. Hopefully our listeners have been able to pick up some things like, oh, these are things I need to really improve on in my relationship or think about from a boundary perspective. Because if we don't hold those boundaries well in our relationship, it's going to be really challenging as the longer you're married. Those boundary challenges don't go away. They will become more intense over time. Yeah. So no matter if you've been married for 5 days or 50 years or 60 years, if you have a struggle if boundaries in your relationship, it's time to stop and take a pause and go, how can I reevaluate? And the other person may not be ready to do it with you yet, and that's okay. Yeah. It starts with you. Absolutely. It doesn't, you don't have to have, they may come along for the ride once you get going. It's okay. And they may, so I'm glad that we have had this conversation today. I appreciate all the conversation, all the things we've been able to talk about back and forth today, Becca.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you guys for joining us again today on our podcast. Like I said at the beginning, if you have missed any of the previous podcasts, we just encourage you to go check them out. They're some good information for you to be able to put into your information toolbox, if you will. So in the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about us, we'd like you to go to our website, which is peacerestored.net. And don't forget to check out our show notes, where you'll be able to find links, additional content, and a few maybe video links as well. As we wrap up our discussion today, make sure to stay tuned, as we'll continue to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.